I'm Andrew Katz, and I'm a lawyer from the United Kingdom. I've been specialising in open technologies, including free and open source software, for 20 years, and a lot of that work has involved license compliance issues. My firm, Moorcrofts, is an OpenChain partner, as is our sister company, Orcro Limited. Moorcrofts provides legal advice on licensing issues, whereas Orcro Limited concentrates on implementing OpenChain practice and procedure, including advising on developing and implementing policies for clients. One of the questions I get asked most frequently is how to get started with OpenChain compliance. Many clients ask for a template open source policy, and while there are plenty of really good policies out there, the difficulty is that it is tricky to map each of the parts of these policies onto the specific requirements of the OpenChain specification. So, a couple of years ago, we decided that it would be a good idea to develop a specific template open source policy which closely follows each part of the OpenChain specification, so you can see at a glance how each OpenChain requirement can be implemented into a policy. I gave a talk about the then current draft of the policy at last year's Open Compliance Summit, and I received some great feedback and suggestions which I've now incorporated into the latest version of the template. Of course, the most momentous news is clearly the fact that OpenChain is now an official ISO standard, so the policy has been updated to take account of that. We've also simplified a couple of areas and made it easier to use. We're extending the template so that it works for different types of organisations. The core template is written with a medium-sized software development company in mind. The assumption here is that the software development work is being carried out inside the organisation. But we have also been working on adapting it so it can work with foundations which have a combination of external contributors to their projects and internal development staff. Next on the roadmap is to provide a variant which works for micro businesses of 1 or 2 people. A founding principle of OpenChain is that it's intended to work for companies and organisations of all types and sizes, and by presenting a template open source policy, we wanted to make it as easy as possible to get started. This also includes making it available in multiple languages. Some fantastic work has already been done in this area, and we hope to have this current version of the template available in multiple languages as soon as we can. Just one word of caution. OpenChain is very much about what needs to be done to implement an effective open source compliance policy, not how to do it. For this reason, I stress that the template is designed to be a helpful starting point, but it's by no means necessary for any organisation wishing to implement an OpenChain conform and compliance program to adopt the template. In fact, to do so without first carefully considering how each part of it works in practice for each organisation would be a mistake. So, bearing that in mind, let's see how to find the template so I can guide you through it and explain how it works. Okay, you want to go to openchainproject.org and then scroll down to Get Reference Material. Click on that and then scroll down until you get to the reference policy template, and you can either download as Excel or download as ODS. Just click on one of those and it will download the file for you. And there you go. Okay, so when you open up the spreadsheet, this is what it looks like. You'll see it's got a number of tabs, and it should open on the Start Here tab. The key tab is the Policy tab. So, what we have is a number of columns, and each of those columns has got a heading which explains what's going on. So let's look at the first 2 columns first, columns B and C. So if we just select those to make them easier to see and then scroll down and have a look, you'll see that on the left hand side in each case there's a number, and then on the right hand side there is some text, and you can see that this text is a bunch of definitions. And if you're familiar with the OpenChain specification, you'll notice that those definitions look very, very familiar. In fact, they are exactly the same definitions as you can see exist in the OpenChain specification itself, and in fact the numbering is exactly the same as well. So let's go back to the policy sheet, and what we have here is essentially the complete text of the OpenChain specification version 2.1, which is the version that has been submitted to ISO and accepted for publication. So if we just scroll down slowly, you can see that we've got all the numbers here, and on the right hand side we have the text. So if we go, for example, to 3.1.2 competence, here's the OpenChain specification itself, the document that was submitted to ISO, and if we go to 312. Here's 312 competence with the relevant wording. So let's go back to the spreadsheet and scroll down to 312 competence. So essentially, if you take columns B and C of this spreadsheet, and if you copy and paste them into a text document, then what you get is the complete OpenChain specification. Okay, so let's skip over E and F now and go to what's really the core of this document, which is the policy text. So let's look at column G. So against each of the requirements and verification materials required in the OpenChain specification, we've drafted some generic policy text. So let's have a look at the question. What do you need to have? You need a documented open source policy, and then the policy text says our open source policy can be found on the company's intranet in a certain location. So let's have a look at the next one. Documented procedure that makes program participants aware of the existence of the open source policy, for example via training, internal wiki, or other practical communication method. So what would you have in a policy that would fulfill that requirement? Here we go. All joining program participants will be made aware of the open source policy and associated training policy and its location during the induction process. This will be recorded on the induction checklist or HR system, and so on. So we go all the way through the whole of the specification, and in each case where there is a requirement, then that is fulfilled by looking at the generic policy text that we've provided. So let's look at another one. For example, it's a requirement to have a written statement that clearly defines the scope and limits of the program. The generic policy text says this open source policy covers all products which company makes available or distributes externally. In future, company may determine that different products and projects are part of different programs, and each program may have a different scope. So you can immediately see how you can adopt that and then modify it for your own company's purposes. And I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but hopefully you get a flavour of the way in which each of the requirements that are contained within the specification are mapped onto some generic policy text which can be used by your organisation. And it makes it very, very easy to figure out whether the requirement has been fulfilled, because these requirements are mapped across directly to the policy text. So essentially, if you take the whole of column G and you copy it, and then you go into another document, let's open a new LibreOffice document, and then you paste it, then what we have here is something that you can start editing to create your open source policy. Now, there's a few other things that we've had to do to make this work. I mean, you'll see if we go up to the top that we've mapped across all of the definitions are almost identical where they possibly can be with the definitions in the original specification. Occasionally we've added a few additional definitions as well. So for example, we've been talking about the roles that are involved, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but a key individual who is involved in the program is potentially an open source compliance board member. So in the policy text, we've suggested a definition for open source compliance board member. There is no requirement to use this terminology. There is no requirement to use this mechanism. It's purely one way of fulfilling the OpenChain specification requirements. Okay, let's take a look at heading 312, competence. We'll see that it's a requirement that the organisation identifies the roles and corresponding responsibility of those roles that affect the performance and effectiveness of the program, and that the organisation determines necessary competence of the programme participants fulfilling each role, ensures that those programme participants are competent on the basis of education, training and experience, and takes actions to acquire the necessary competence and retains appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. And the verification materials required for that are, first of all, a documented list of roles with corresponding responsibilities for the different participants in the programme, and then a document that identifies the competencies for each role. So the way that we've addressed this is by establishing a separate sheet which is called roles. So this would also become part of your standard OpenChain open source policy. And again, the roles are going to differ from organisation to organisation. So this is just a sample. It's just an idea of what you can do. So here we've identified what each of the roles are. So open source compliance board member, we talked about that role a little bit earlier. A compliance lead, very significant role. Open source liaison, and then we go down to people like software developers who can be different levels, team leaders, architects, release engineers, and even down in terms of marketing. Marketing people can be involved in an open source program as well, and they should also be brought into the scope of the definition of roles. So for each of those roles, we have a role code, and they're pretty straightforward. CBM is compliance board member, C-lead is compliance lead, liaison is liaison, external counsel is ex-counsel. And then if you wanted to use this as a directory for internal purposes of who's within each role, then you could adopt this and incorporate their names in here and date of appointments and so on. Contact details, but the most important thing that we have here is the description of the role. So for example, we've defined the open source compliance board member as the board member with overall responsibility for open source compliance and strategy. The open source compliance lead is a direct report. Issues are escalated to the open source compliance board member from the open source compliance lead. And then the open source compliance lead, so we've just explained, reports to the board member, and this is the senior manager with day-to-day executive responsibility for open source compliance, and reports to the board member. So we've looked at the sort of competencies that each role has to have here, and again I stress you have to look at these individually within your own organisation. This is just an idea of the sort of detail that's required, but also the type of competencies that you might be asking for in that particular role. So we're looking at distinction between high level and low level. As far as the board member is concerned, from a high level, they need to understand intellectual property risk relating to open source, and they need to understand the development process as well. But as far as their detailed understanding is concerned, they have to have a detailed understanding of company management and structure, and they also have to have communication skills. And as far as their time requirement is concerned, this is likely to be combined with other roles. For example, they may also be the CTO, but they do have to be a board member for this particular role description. Flowing this through to the open source compliance lead, then what they need to know about at a high level is the management structure. They need to know about the open source policy from a process perspective, and they also need to have a high level understanding of the software architecture. They must have a detailed understanding of IP risk, they must have a detailed understanding of the development process, and they must have highly competent communication skills. And in this case, we're saying that this is a full-time requirement. So if you go through each of the entries in this particular list, you'll see that we've gone through a similar sort of process. So, for example, DevOps specialist is somebody who manages the development tool chain, and they have to have a high-level understanding of team management structure and OpenChain policy and procedures, but they need to have a detailed understanding of the overall architecture of the program's product, and obviously you may well have one or more DevOps specialists for different products. They must have a full knowledge of industry standards and market development. They must understand what tool chains are available, but they also have to have knowledge of the IP issues raised by tool chain choices, and they need to have good communication skills, and they need to understand developer needs. So you'll see we've been through each of these roles, and we've suggested the sort of skill sets that are required in order to carry out those roles, and also considered for many of them, not all of them, the amount of time that is required as part of a properly resourced role in order for an individual to carry out that work. So you'll recall that under the competence section of the OpenChain specification, we need to ensure that the program participants are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, and or experience. So if we look at the verification materials for that, then we will see that that maps onto our policy text as follows. So all program participants must undertake training covering the competencies required for their role, and at a minimum basic training. Appendix 5 contains details of the training requirements for each role. So let's have a look at Appendix 5. What we have here is across the top, and you'll recall from when we had a look at the Roles tab that each of the roles was given a code, and these are the same codes here. So against each code, we've had a look at the training that each of those is required, and then on this column here we have the different modules of training that are potentially available. So for example, an introduction to OpenChain talks about the OpenChain project, a brief history, who benefits, how it works, key concepts, why it's good for the company and its business, and its relationship with suppliers and customers. That's a very high-level course, and you'll find, not surprisingly, that everyone involved in the program has to be exposed to that particular training. We've looked at a number of different modules here, and these modules, with a couple of additions, have been taken very much from the OpenChain curriculum, which is also available on the OpenChain Project website. So each of these is different sections from the curriculum. Each of these explains briefly what that part of the curriculum is. So basically we've taken the OpenChain curriculum and we've modularized it. We've described what each of those modules is, and then we've mapped that against each of the particular roles. So we'll see if there's a 1 in the box, it means that training needs to be undertaken by that particular individual. If there isn't a 1 in the box, that means that it doesn't. So you'll want to complete this individually, obviously, for your own organization. So the reason that we've put numbers in here rather than just putting an X or something is to open the door to the possibility that we might want to have different levels of training for each individual category. So it may be the case that 1 is basic training, 2 is intermediate training, and 3 is advanced training. Okay, let's go and have a look at another specific requirement of the OpenChain specification. So if we take a look at license obligations, you'll see that it's necessary to have a documented procedure to review and document the obligations, restrictions and rights granted by each identified license. And the way that we've fulfilled that in the draft policy is by putting in a procedure. And the procedure involves the open source compliance lead making a preliminary assessment of each license based on the criteria set out in Appendix 2, and then a procedure which means that if that preliminary assessment isn't able to be made, then if necessary making reference to external counsel and making sure that the decision is documented. So what's in Appendix 2? Well, let's go and take a look. Here's a license categorization template. It's pretty basic. We've only categorized 10 licenses in here. These are all fairly common free and open source software licenses. Almost certainly you'll need to have different and more licenses when you do your own categorization. So this is designed as no more than just an indication of the sort of information that you need to consider and to apply to an appropriate policy in this area. So we have the license names, we have the SPDX identifiers, and then we've categorized them into a number of types, and the types are down here. So each one of those licenses is categorized as either a permissive license, weak copyleft, strong copyleft, SaaS or proprietary license. Okay, so we've just taken a look at license categorization in Appendix 2, but another factor that should be taken into account are the other criteria that you might want to apply in order to ensure that only appropriate software components end up in your codebase, and they go much further than just simply license compliance questions. So this maps into our policy text by the sentence, the inclusion of any code into any release of supplied software shall follow Appendix 3, source acceptability criteria. Let's take a look at Appendix 3. The key to Appendix 3 is to look at the steps which you have to go through whenever you have a new piece of code that you want to incorporate into your code base. So you start by identifying the use case for the code. What are you going to be using it for? You've got to identify the provenance, where it came from. You've got to identify its license, whether you want to modify it or not, and then you apply the code selection filter, which I'll come to in a second. You document the choice that you've made, you prepare the compliance materials necessary, and then you publish the compliance materials, if applicable. So let's go through each one of these in turn. Now, the sort of use cases that we're looking at could be as follows. They could be just purely internal use, or you could be using the software for testing and limited distribution. You could be deploying the software on a SaaS basis, either on server side, or it could be some components which end up being served over to be used on the client side, or it could be distributed generally, and that could either be part of a software distribution or it could be on some form of embedded device. And then finally we could have some special criteria that you want to use for a specific named project. So for each item of code you need to determine what the use cases are. And then you follow a number of source acceptability criteria. And again, I would stress very, very strongly that these need to be looked at from the perspective of your own organization, your own risk appetite, and your own use cases. So in this case, we're looking at a number of factors that may determine whether you want to use a piece of code or not. You may be interested in whether it has a commercial sponsor or not. And in that case, it may be that if nobody's a sponsor, you rate that 0. If it has a well-known commercial sponsor, then you rate that 10. It could be that you do similar classifications as far as foundation sponsors are concerned. So 0 if there's no foundation sponsor, or 10 if it's a well-respected organization such as the Linux Foundation. You might want to look at code maturity, you might want to look at stability of the code, you might want to look at the sort of activity that's been going on as far as that particular project is concerned. And again, it may be the case there's been no activity simply because that particular piece of code is so good and so well understood that nobody's needed to fix any bugs or anything. But that's a determination that you'll have to make yourself. These are just the sort of criteria that you might want to consider when you're putting some sort of process together in this area. So it could be the reputation of the particular product, some metric involving software quality. You'd want to look at security. So does it have any vulnerabilities? And if it does, how quickly are they fixed? And also the degree of community involvement. And then by scoring each of those criteria, then you could come up with an overall score that rates the software, the extent to which you're prepared to use it or not. And then you look at the code selection filter, and in certain cases, if you're using something purely for internal use, and if it's being used for testing, for example, you may be prepared to use something that doesn't have particularly good provenance and is fairly buggy. It's just something that is just convenient at the time. But clearly, if it's code that you're shipping, then that's going to be something that needs to meet much higher levels of acceptability. So I'm not going to go into these in any greater depth, but it just gives you an indication of the sort of process that you can go through when, over and above just purely looking at license compliance issues, you want to determine whether you want to incorporate a particular piece of code into your code base. Let's have a look at this requirement of the OpenChain specification. So there needs to be a documented procedure for handling the review and remediation of non-compliant cases. And our sample policy wording requires that the open source compliance lead follows a procedure to deal with them. Factor 3 here states that if the issue is genuine, apply Appendix 4 incident severity criteria to prioritize and determine the appropriate response according to Appendix 4 incident response criteria. Let's have a look at Appendix 4. So, if there is a non-compliance incident, then first of all, it's important to figure out what the severity of that particular incident is. And to do that, we need to take certain factors into account. So we need to consider what the reputational risk is. We need to determine what the availability of a compliant component is. Is it possible to deal with that problem simply by swapping in another component? What is the cost or the ease of reworking or implementing a workaround? Can we remove that component and maybe come up with some sort of workaround? Is it possible to change the deployment mechanism? So is it possible that this is code that is compliant if it's deployed internally, but not if we ship it? So maybe we use the functionality internally rather than in shipped code instead. Re-engineering is required there. Then we have to consider whether there's a problem of injunctive relief if we end up with an injunction against us that stops us from using the code, what the potential damages are in terms of costs, whether there is a requirement that we have to release proprietary code that we're unable to do because maybe it's proprietary code that we've obtained from a third party and we're not allowed to do that. It may be that there's dangers of different sorts of claims from customers, and we also need to have a look and see if there's also an existing open source enforcement code that applies to that. So these are all criteria, factors that need to be taken into account. And then we need to determine how to respond to it. So it may be that simply by updating and publishing non-compliant notices we can deal with the issue that way. Or it may be that we're able to select an equivalent component that is compliant, is under a different license, doesn't have the particular issues that we have with this component. It may be the case that we're able to rework the code to include compliant components, so that would involve re-engineering, rewriting code potentially, or it may be that we
can change the mode of distribution. And it may be that we can approach the licensors of the code and obtain a different license that brings us back into compliance. Now we've covered all the major aspects of the policy. Just one thing I wanted to mention very briefly is that you may recall at the outset I mentioned that we are extending this template policy to cover other types of organizations. One that we currently have here is foundation specific, and the main difference between the generic policy text and this policy text is that it recognizes that a foundation may be accepting contributions from outside the organization, but it's unreasonable for all of the individuals who are submitting contributions to completely comply with the OpenChain specification and therefore become program participants, but rather it's more appropriate that as long as that there is a gatekeeper, so in other words somebody who ensures that all of the contributions that are made comply with the code selection criteria and are otherwise fully compliant with the OpenChain specification, and as long as that particular person themselves is a program participant and has therefore been through all of the appropriate training, competence assessments, etc., 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 then there is no reason why the code shouldn't be incorporated into the code base, and that therefore the program as a whole can be OpenChain compliant. I'm not going to go into the detail of the changes that have been made here, but there are one or two areas where there have been some tweaks to allow that to happen, and indeed there may be companies which are accepting outside contributions as well that may want to apply the same sort of policy wording. The final thing that I wanted to mention that you may have noticed is if you take a look at column F, you'll see there's a column headed conformance questions. This simply maps the conformance questions which are in existence already as part of the OpenChain self-certification questionnaire and maps them off against the specification requirements. Just a useful reference. Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for improvements, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. We're very keen to continue to improve the OpenChain policy template to try and make it as useful for as many people as possible. Thank you and goodbye.